Greetings viewer, you join me in what has to be one of the most capable all-round cars currently on the market. The new BMW 3 Series Touring, the G21.
Hello, what can I help you with?
As you can see, it's a really helpful car.
Sorry, I didn't hear that properly.
And it's quite polite.
Unfortunately, I can't give you any information on the windscreen washer level.
I genuinely believe that. While browsing through BMW's press release for this new car, for this new 3 Series, I noticed that the manufacturer says that even though it's larger, it's a bit larger than the car it replaces, it's actually lighter. But I actually compared this exact spec to the previous F31 in this very similar spec, so a 2-liter car with a automatic gearbox and all-wheel drive, and this car is actually a bit heavier. I think it was 40 kilos or something, so around 80-90 pounds. And as a result, it's not any faster than the old car. And in fact, it has exactly the same specs as that, engine-wise, because even though this new engine is has a different turbocharger setup, it's just as powerful and just as torquey as the engine it replaces. So even though this car is slightly heavier by a few dozen kilos, not much, than the car it replaces, BMW quotes it as being able to accelerate to 100 kilometers an hour in exactly the same 7.4 seconds, and top speed is the same 225 kilometers an hour. So at least it isn't any slower than the car it replaces. So that's I guess that's an achievement for a bigger vehicle that has quite a bit more space inside. So regarding the differences between this and a sedan in the exact spec, this one does 0 to 100 kilometers an hour in 7.4 seconds, while the sedan does it in 6.97 seconds, depending on spec. And this has a top speed of 225 kilometers an hour, whereas the sedan is 9 kilometers an hour faster, so it peaks at 234 kilometers an hour. It is worth noting that this car, the Touring, the wagon, is around 100 kilos heavier than the sedan, so that's 220 pounds heavier. Had this car not had xDrive fitted to it, its sprint time would have gone down from 7.4 seconds to 7.1 seconds from 0 to 100 kilometers an hour, and speed would have gone up by 5 kilometers an hour, and it would have risen from 225 kilometers an hour to 230 kilometers an hour. xDrive also adds 55 kilos extra, and it actually affects this car's turning circle, which I did notice, and I had to maneuver it more than I would have liked to, instead of just going around some bends and obstacles that I'm used to going around. And finally, xDrive also adds 0.2 liters per 100 kilometers to the claimed efficiency. So this achieves 4.9 liters per 100 kilometers claimed, although no. Finally, this particular example, being the M Sport version, has a lower, stiffer suspension. It's lower by 1 centimeter. And you can really feel the extra stiffness. Although for me personally, especially if this car has the adaptive dampers and you set them in comfort, it's not a problem. Even on these kind of huge 19-inch rims, if you ask me. I think 19s are big. I have 17s on my car and I think they're plenty big enough. If you put the car in sport and stiffen the suspension, that has a dramatic effect on how this car feels. And you should only really enable it on very smooth roads and when there's a risk of it rolling around a bit too much in the bends. So it's on a twisty mountain road like the one I drove on yesterday, which was relatively smooth, and I was able to drive with the suspension in its stiffer setting for most of the drive. And since this car has the adaptive damper, it also has the adaptive mode here on the among the buttons for the driving mode selection. So adaptive mode is predictive adjustment of the vehicle setting for the driving situation. So in essence, you put it in adaptive mode, and if you're just poodling around, not doing any sort of speed and not driving the car aggressively, it will basically put itself in comfort mode. Whereas if it senses you starting to drive quicker and more aggressively, tugging the wheel and just putting more G-force into the car, because it has a G-meter and it knows what you're doing with it, it will stiffen the suspension and make the steering heavier, as it would if you would put it in sport mode on your own. But if you live in a country that doesn't have especially smooth roads, I would avoid the 19-inch rims with the ridiculously sticky and very expensive Michelin Pilot Sport 4 tires, and go for 18-inch rims. And when it comes time to change your first set of tires, I would ditch the run flats. I know it's maybe it might be a controversial point, but non-run flats are improve the ride. Like this car with 18-inch rims with not run flats and this suspension setup, and if you keep it in comfort mode, it will be remarkably calm and cosseting. Even this setup with the big rims and the run flats is still pretty good if you keep it in comfort mode, at least in my opinion. I must also admit that I'm a fan of the look of this car, both inside and out. And since I'm inside right now, that's what I'm going to talk about first. So this one has a digital gauge cluster and a larger screen with the latest version of xDrive, which is great. It has a gesture control and lots of features. But infotainments are really not my thing. If they're not offensive and they work, you can easily pair your phone and listen to music and that kind of stuff. It's fine. One thing that some reviewers complain about is the fact that this car doesn't have Android Auto, but I really don't care about that. I know some people find it quite offensive. But it does have optional Apple CarPlay, which this car doesn't have. But again, I think that's a feature that's really, really worth having if the infotainment itself is bad. Although I do miss having Waze on this big screen. That would be a nice feature. Maybe BMW could integrate it somehow, without having to mirror your phone onto the screen. Being the M Sport trim, this car has this really snazzy black headliner, which contrasts with these Oyster Sport seats, which are comfortable, supportive, and they look good, for now at least. I mean, this car has just under 9,000 kilometers on its odometer. Some people say that this black headliner makes the interior of cars feel claustrophobic and dark. But I have to disagree with that. I think it's awesome, and I want to swap the one in my car, which is a regular light gray colored one, with one of these from a breaker's yard or something, because I just love the look of it. I'm a super fan of a black headliner, and I think it's a sporty touch. I would definitely have in my own car, and I'm going to have in my own car. I must admit that I really like the layout and the quality of this latest 3 Series interior. The base price for one of these, at least here in Romania, is 36,100 euros for a bog standard rear-wheel drive only example. If you want xDrive, that adds another 10,000 euros, and that raises the price, the base price of an all-wheel drive version of this, to 46,100 euros. This car I'm driving today has a total price of 71,000 euros. And granted, it has a lot of kit on it, but it's not fully spec'd. There are still some options that it's lacking. Probably the most costly thing on this car is the 6,000 odd euro M Sport pack that gives it sporty front and rear bumpers and side skirts, as well as larger rims. This car runs 19-inch staggered wheels, and I could really feel them over that speed bump. Under the hood of this G21 320d is BMW's latest version of its 2-liter diesel engine. This current incarnation, called the B47, has a twin turbo setup, so it's no longer the previous twin scroll turbo setup. This one actually has 2 physical turbochargers. And what's interesting about it is that even the lower powered 318D has the exact same setup. So this engine makes 190 PS, or European horsepower, at 4,000 RPM, and it's got 400 Newton meters of torque that's delivered flat between 1750 and 2500 RPM. Regarding this powertrain, it's a bit underwhelming. I have to confess. That's my thought on it. Whereas most BMWs feel faster than the claimed time BMW supplies, this one feels about right, or slower. It feels like an 8-second car, or 8-ish second car, even though it's a bit faster than 8 seconds. So it's around 7.5. I'm sure if you have this engine in the lighter sedan and without the added heft of xDrive, it will feel punchier and more responsive. But in this big wagon with the xDrive, it's not as fast as you'd like it to be. Thankfully, it's hooked up to the excellent ZF automatic transmission, the latest version of the 8-speed, which is better than before, especially in its sportier mode. In its sportier mode, it only has one. So whereas before the transmission was undeniably smooth and silky, and you hardly felt the gear changes in comfort mode when driving it sedately, when you put it in sport mode, it was still a bit too smooth, I think. Now though, if you put it in sport mode, it slams you in the back harder than before. Although not as hard as in the M135i I tested, which has a different 8-speed from ZF, because that's a transverse mounted, not a longitudinally mounted engine. So it's a different unit altogether, a different gearbox. It's still 8-speed, but it's different. In that car, when you put it in Sport Plus, it properly slams you in the back. I quite enjoy that feeling when I'm on it and when I drive it quickly. Since this is a BMW, you buy it because you expect it to be good to drive. And this G21 is amazing. It's awesome. There's very little to fault about the way it goes down the road, the way it turns, stops, steers, and does all the rest of the handling bits. On the twisties, the G21 disguises its heft quite well. It's super agile. And with these Michelin Pilot Sport 4 tires, it really sticks. In fact, this is where most of the fun comes from in the G21 on a twisty road, especially this 320D with the M Sport pack and big rims with sticky tires on them. It's from exploiting this car's immense levels of grip and very balanced chassis. This is a very common BMW 3 Series trait, and this latest G21, even though it's the wagon, so it's the more practical family-oriented version, it still grips the road very, very well indeed. In fact, a while back I drove the sedan 320D, and while this does feel ever so slightly heavier, it's the difference is negligible, to be honest, between how that handles and how this handles. They're both super accomplished. And given that this car has a relatively low-powered 2-liter diesel engine, it doesn't really stress the chassis. It feels like it could take a lot more, and it can take a lot more, and it does take a lot more. I'm looking at you, M340i. The first point I want to make about driving this car and being on board, aside from all the driving dynamic stuff, has to do with refinement. Even with these big tires, there's hardly any tire roar that you can hear in the car, even at higher speeds. Wind whistle is non-existent. BMW fills these A-pillars with sound-absorbing foam, so you won't hear any whistle coming off the pillar mirror area. So that's pretty good. The driving position is spot on. The steering wheel, I don't like it as much as the previous M Sport steering wheel with a round center for the airbag, but this one isn't bad. It's super nice to the touch. This leather feels pretty great. Let's hope it doesn't go all shiny in 5 years' time. So now we're doing 59 kilometers an hour in town, and there's no noise in the cabin whatsoever. Trunk capacity, or boot capacity, in this car is 500 liters, which is just a smidgen more than what its main rival, the Mercedes C-Class wagon, can muster. Although this car does have the cool split thing, so you can open just the glass part when you just have some lighter items which you can lift over and then place into the trunk without having to wait for it to rise and then wait for it to go back down. It's a quicker solution for when you do your shopping and whatnot. I like it a lot. And apparently it's been a feature on all Touring 3 Series and all BMW wagons, although I'm not sure about others, but let's just stick to the 3 Series. It's been a feature since the days of the E36. So the E36 had it, the E46 had it, the E91 had it, the F31 had it, and now this car. As a swift and sporty family hauler with amazing handling, remarkable sure-footedness, undeniable exterior style, and undeniable interior design and quality, for the most part, the G21 is probably the best car in its class. I mean, in terms of blending it all together in one cohesive, seamless, load-lugging package.